Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here, 4 p.m. Sydney time for the Big Shrink, with myself, Ash King, and the founder and head psychologist of the Indigo Project, Mary Hoang. Hey,
Hey
Mary.
Ash, nice to see your face.
Caught you out there. I was going to say the same. How's everything been for you this week?
Well, it's obviously been quite a challenging moment in history for watching all the protests that are going on in the US, and also reflecting upon how this is not necessarily a new issue, but something that is also happening right here on our soils. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad in a way that there is so much world attention on what's happening at the moment, but it's also just, I guess I just feel sad that it's has to kind of take so much to kind of erupt, for people to actually start paying attention to, especially here, things that have been happening for hundreds of years.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. I've been feeling the exact same way. And I guess, in terms of all the progress that we've made as a society, like particularly over just like the last 100, even the last sort of 50, 70 years, to recognize that we're now at a point where, the things that have to change, they're not out like as out in the open, as things that we can make laws and change things on. It's kind of like these insidious systems that creep just below the surface, and it almost feels like there needs to be some serious agitation just so everyone's going to pay attention to this.
Absolutely, and I think it's really interesting how it also asks us to look at ourselves, and how, in how we have positions of privilege, and how are we unconsciously, in ways that we're not meaning to, perhaps perpetrating any of the kind of systemic racism that we're kind of observing in the world.
Mm. Mm.
Big topics.
Huge topics, yeah. Maybe something that we can go to explore in the next couple of weeks.
Absolutely.
um, but this week, and everyone who may have seen our little prep posts, is going to be exploring relationships, which is, something that you and I are always chatting about, always interested about, and particularly the idea of letting go and how that can be really challenging and really difficult, particularly with the hold that relationships have on all our lives. What do you think?
Yeah, well, as a psychologist, so many people are coming in to talk about past relationships, or relationships that are still affecting them from many years ago. And I think it's so important to acknowledge that the landscape for relationships has really changed. Modern relationships, we're having a lot more of them, not just friends, but, romantic relationships, where I think, potentially in our parents' age and our grandparents' time back in history, I mean, marriage and relationships were seen, you kind of stayed in your relationship. And nowadays, where everyone's kind of swiping and dating multiple people at the same time, and coming in and out of relationships, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, people are learning about what they need and what they want from relationships. But I think the challenge is that, people are going into new relationships potentially having not let go of the previous one, or not haven't healed from it, or looked at some of the situations that potentially, you know, they might like to change about themselves, or acknowledge, some patterns of behavior that they might not like to bring into the next relationship. So yeah, relationships has really changed. And I think that our human kind of tendency to avoid pain sees us wanting to get over them as quickly as possible. Sometimes we get into a new relationship, sometimes we just go out and party, sometimes we just kind of, avoid it, and cover it up. So I think it is, really important for everyone who is potentially, still trying to get over a relationship, from the past, or is currently going through challenges at the moment, is is to really acknowledge the emotions that were unfelt in their previous relationships. And I'm really known, in my client work to give clients an activity where they write their ex a letter, whether that's an ex-friend or an ex-partner or even a parent, and to really kind of get their feelings down that weren't expressed in their relationship. And this is no holds barred. This is a letter that you don't send, that allows you to express true emotions and get out any anger, any sadness, any resentment that was still there. Because I think that's what's really difficult, is that when we don't allow ourselves to feel these emotions, we repress them. And although we might not kind of express them, we're still actually experiencing them. And it can actually cause us to feel even worse in the long term if we're continually suppressing our emotions through drinking or not talking about them or finding ways to keep busy to keep ourselves away from them. So I think the first step is definitely, acknowledging the pain of loss and that grief that comes when we lose someone from our lives, because it's not just the grief of not being able to have a person physically near you, but it's also the loss of shared and mutual plans, ideas that you had for the future together, like dreams. We were going to go here or take this holiday, or we were going to have kids, and we had these, this vision together. And I think that there is so much that people grieve when they're leaving a relationship or have lost a relationship, and all of that needs to come, I guess, out of us. Those feelings of being hurt, feeling guilty, lost, depressed, sad, anxious, and we kind of have to really feel through loss.
Yeah, it's tough and it's uncomfortable. And I think that, even with the terms like grief and loss, they're not really terms that I think that on a wider scale we're all that comfortable applying to things like the end of relationships that, haven't been marked by sort of death or tragedy.
Mm.
Someone who just commented quite an interesting question, which was sort of along the lines of, you've had a relationship that's ended quite a long time ago and you're still feeling yourself affected by, the loss or the end of that relationship. And I guess we go through, these more rational thoughts of going, why aren't I over it? And it's been this long and I've had other relationships. Like, why am I still dealing with this shit?
Absolutely, yeah. It is quite complex when people come out of relationships, and we hold wounds that we carry not just from past relationships but also from from childhood as well. And we can want to get over them, but sometimes it is quite a long process whereby there are techniques that we can utilize that can help bring us back into connection with ourselves again. So in acknowledging that it still hurts, that it's still painful, we can go through processes of self-compassion, where when those feelings come up again of feeling hurt or sad or lost or afraid again, that we apply a sense of it's okay to feel like this still, instead of berating or judging the fact that we're still not over it. I can give an example of a relationship, my first relationship, when I was 14, which was more than 20 years ago. I actually had still been carrying that relationship up until very recently, and I think it still plays out in my life in ways that I'm not fully consciously aware of. But when it does, I have to remind myself, wow, that was an experience that was really tough for me, and it's completely okay for me to feel still sad over it. It doesn't necessarily mean that I can't move forward, but feeling the pain of past experience does not necessarily mean that you haven't grown from it as well. And so there's two kind of avenues that we can take in terms of self-inquiry: is self-forgiveness. Like, am I beating myself up for things that I have done or didn't do in this relationship? Or am I even beating myself up for not being over it by now? And so that's kind of the path of self-compassion that we can really, inquire more deeply into and say, well, how can I forgive myself for whatever happened in that relationship? Can I write myself a letter from a wise self and see myself compassionately and give myself that compassion and actually feel that in my body? And then another pathway we can take as well is sometimes we haven't let go of a relationship because we haven't forgiven the other person. So obviously, I'm not sure everyone who's watching what situation they've been in, but sometimes we have been pretty hard done by in a relationship, and we hold on to feelings of resentment that, when we start to understand how the mind and the body work in relationship with each other, that we are the first recipients of our emotions. So if I'm going to sit here and I'm going to think, I'm really angry about this thing and I'm really frustrated at this person and I can't believe that happened last year or last week, or my thoughts will create sensations within my body that are really challenging for me to hold. And so when we recognize that we are the first recipient of our emotions, we recognize that forgiveness is not necessarily something that is about becoming friends with that person again or letting that person off the hook. It doesn't belittle or deny what happens, but this type of forgiveness is an opportunity for us to let go of any resentment that we may still be holding towards that relationship. So I guess there's two different paths there. It's like, what is actually happening when thoughts of an old relationship come up for someone? Is it thoughts about the self? I wish I had done this. I could have done this better. Or is it about the other? I can't believe they did this to me. I can't believe that happened. And that may take people down two different paths of forgiving the other and forgiving the self.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, huge. Big,
Yeah.
very, very challenging. Forgiveness is very hard. And I definitely recommend people, write down situations that are challenging for them and try in their own words and in their own way to forgive either themselves or the other person that is in question. And through that experience, you will recognize, you will recognize how hard it is.
Mm-hmm.
And you may be able to ask yourself, why am I holding on to this? Is there a protection in me holding on to maybe the hurt or the resentment of this relationship ending? Because potentially it's easy for us to beat ourselves up for not getting over a relationship or still thinking about it, but everything that we do has a motivation that we might not typically understand, but it is trying to protect us from something. So sometimes it's like, I'm still thinking about that relationship because there's a part of me which is like, if I think about it and I remember it and I remember what happened, I'm going to make sure that I don't get into a relationship like that ever again. Or I might put my walls up and keep my heart closed so I don't get hurt again. And so, I think people often judge themselves for some of the reactions that they have after leaving a relationship. But if we can try to look at these behaviors, how is this behavior or thought process or feeling protecting me? Then we can start to soften a little bit and go down that path of self-compassion as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it also reminds me of this topic that we've explored so many times, one which I am very personally resistant to, that constant dialectic of sort of pain and growth, and how they don't exist in isolation to one another. And I think that that's often, like you've said in the past, we try to get away from pain, and you can't get away from the pain of a relationship that's gone the way you didn't want it to go. Like, that hurts. And there's not a period that's like, okay, so you've got 2.5 months just to deal with all that pain, and then off you go onto growth. Like, we're
Yeah.
doing the shit at the same time, and it feels yucky and confusing, I suppose, because we think it should be clean, but it's really not.
Well, the recognition of that pain again is like, you know, if we didn't feel pain, we'd been in a lot of trouble, whether that's physical pain or emotional pain, or the pain of like having a stomach ache, or the pain of, you know, being really thirsty or hungry. I mean, these are signals that are telling us that something is either wrong, that we need to connect, we need to drink, or we need to eat, or we need to tend to a wound within ourselves. So that pain is, you know, drawing us to ask ourselves, you know, are you okay? What do you need right now? And I think that healing from a relationship, it's so important for us to look at what needs weren't met in that relationship. So it's really easy, I think, after a relationship to fantasize about it and to put it on a pedestal and to be like, that was the best relationship of my whole life and I'm never going to meet anyone like that again. That person was perfect. And often it's simply not the case. It is usually like that may be the emotion, but that's the emotion of attachment.
Mm.
But essentially, if we can look a little bit more logically at the situation, potentially, you know, there may have been needs like safety, security, attention, love, honesty, trust. You know, there could be so many needs that weren't actually met in that relationship. And to go a little step deeper, sometimes the pain and the grief of a past relationship is also kind of holding pain and grief of other relationships in childhood that have also not been healed. That gets a little bit complex, but it's also something that people can explore with their therapist or with someone that they trust. Is, am I in certain relationship patterns where this relationship is a very similar dynamic to other relationships that I've had in the past, and potentially parts of my relationship with my mother or my father or whoever was taking care of me growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it gets really, really interesting, because when we realize, wow, this relationship really hurts, not because it hurt in and of itself, but because it reminds me subconsciously of how I was in other relationships, particularly with maybe my mom or my dad. And so, again, these signals are pointing us towards opportunities for really quite deep transformational healing if we follow the signals and potentially if we have a guide along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see how it might be difficult to sort of go to those places unguided and unsupported by someone that you feel safe with. So what I wanted to ask as well is, you know, like you said, pain is a necessary factor in our evolution and keeping us alive. It's something that we need to understand, and it's something that we also rightfully fear, because often the things that pain is signaling to us is not a good thing for us. So, you know, as soon as the pain comes up, we're like, okay, that's the bad thing over there. So often, you know, we come out of relationships and we have experienced such a huge, you know, blow of pain. And then, you know, especially when that pain is very fresh and we're really, you know, we remember how it feels throughout our entire body, it's hard to then open ourselves up for the possibility of that to return with another relationship that might not go the way we want it to go. So
Absolutely.
so what would you sort of recommend, you know, as much as you can do the work of sort of letting go, like how
Yeah.
can we be courageous and sort of also allow ourselves to move into new relationships that, you know, that might be amazing, but also might hurt us again?
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, what you're touching upon is how past experience, you know, negative past experience, I guess, in a way, can sort of shift how we perceive future scenarios. You know, not only do we have a negativity bias where we're like, gosh, that thing that happened was really bad, and I'm going to make sure that I scan my environment, be hyper vigilant to that not happening again. Yes, this is a reality that there, our amygdala, a part of our brain that is associated with fear, is going to be a little bit more sensitive when, there are certain sort of things that remind us of our past relationship. And so to I guess counteract that in a way, and to cope and deal with that, I guess there's a few things. Any techniques that are helpful in reducing stress, and helping people to become present in their bodies will help to deactivate, I guess, this default mode network, which sort of runs on fear. So finding ways to, you know, become more present, especially when triggered, can help people to manage and to regulate their emotions. But I think what is also important, is that people create a new vision for their future. So if we're thinking about how the brain works and all the neural pathways, we want a certain neural pathway around fear connected to relationships and certain scenarios to sort of soften or kind of die down. But then we kind of want to be able to strengthen pathways that are associated with relationships are healthy. I can trust people. You know, I can be in an equal relationship and I can imagine what that looks like. So if people can actually create a vision for relationships moving forward, encompassing the needs that weren't met in their previous relationships, taking steps to meet those needs within themselves. But if they can also visualize what a future relationship can look like and also feel that, that is also going to essentially trick the brain into believing that that is a reality. And so we're strengthening these neural pathways by going, this is a date scenario. I'm going to have confess, but when I was doing this work, because I had a long, I guess, spate of very unhealthy relationships in my life, and I recognized that I needed to shift the way that I thought about them moving forward. Otherwise, I'd continue to get into the same pattern. So I wrote out 3 scenarios of like really ideal dates that I would like to be on, how I would feel, what was happening. And every night before I went to sleep, I would go through these scenarios in my head and I would put myself in there as like clear as I could, with as much detail as I could, and with the feeling within my body. And so my brain was essentially being tricked and going, oh, this is actually really happening. And that's how we create new pathways in the brain, through visualization of positive future events. And I just did that every single night, and that started to slowly shift, I guess, my belief around how relationships could be in the future. So that's something that people might like to try.
Yeah, that's an awesome suggestion. I think that as someone who is very anxious, in lots of different areas, it can sometimes feel kind of smart and safe to, you know, only be informed by one's past experiences. And when you think about it, like your own individual lived experience, as important as it is limited to your own life. And so if you only experience, the same things over and over, and, like maybe, yeah, you have been unlucky, or maybe you just have, fallen into a pattern that's easy because of these neural pathways that have kind of been strengthened as you've gone into the same situation over and over. It's hard to not feel like that, that past is also your future. So I mean, having the courage to go. I remember I think, I can't remember what it was. It was like I don't know, a documentary or something, where I remember like an artist who always used to paint himself in relationships, and paint, I think, with women. And all the women would always be looking away from him. They'd never be engaged. They'd always look mad. And then I guess he started reinterpreting these situations and decided to make these interactions more, I guess, loving and accepting. And that, I guess, was his practice of the same thing, like allowing himself to, I mean, not necessarily respond on what he's been through, but what he wants to go through in the future.
Absolutely. And it's not just wishful thinking. I think it's important that we all take time to understand what a relationship vision, encompasses for us in terms of what values do we want, what priorities do we want in it? Like, what kind of things do we want to feel in this relationship? Because I think we're often, maybe just on autopilot or just expecting that everything is going to work out. But I think that we can absolutely have intention behind how we perceive our future. Not to say that everything will work out exactly how we want it to be, but I think that going into new relationships, when you have a better sense of self-worth, that you know what some of your needs and boundaries are because you've looked at some of these situations from your past, your relationship with your parents, other relationships, you have a sense of self. You have a sense of the ability to have your own boundaries. And so I think people are less likely to get into relationships that are the same as their old pattern because they're so much more connected with their own bodies, which, their intuition, and that's the sense of like, oh, that's a kind of red flag for me. And that's something that I'm actually going to pay attention to. I'm going to start trusting myself and putting myself in situations where I feel as though I am being valued. And I also wanted to, I know there's people watching who want to, release the pain of old relationships. And what I've also found really helpful is to create ritual and ceremony around the ending of a relationship. So even if the relationship had ended 5 years ago, if people decide to write that letter, expressing all their emotions, getting out what they need to, I think there's a space for lighting a candle, saying goodbye, having gratitude for the relationship, you know, visualizing what you're letting go of, what you're bringing in, and burning that letter and having a sense of closure, which I think can be difficult when we're just expected to work everything out and close everything on the level of our mind.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in a physical environment, it's something that we can do for ourselves. And the intention of that is that when things get tough, when inevitably your mind might go back into that relationship, you can bring yourself back to a memory of lighting that candle, burning that letter, and remembering, hey, that's the line that I kind of drew in the sand.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That's not something I want to entertain, with my thoughts right now.
It reminds me, if anyone's seen the Michael Jordan documentary, I think when the team disbanded, they mentioned that that's what they did. They had almost like a letting go ceremony, like saying, well, this is the team and we've done all this amazing stuff and we've had all these incredible achievements and now this is coming to an end. And it wasn't just like, okay, it's over now.
Yeah, bye.
Like, bye. They were all encouraged to write up letters, and they ended up burning them. And I remember, because I was kind of like half watching it. My partner's the one who's really into basketball, but I was like, ooh, like this is what we talk about as well. And I guess you can see this importance of letting go in not just one area of your life, but lots of areas. There's lots of things that come to an end, and we rarely give ourselves time to pause and acknowledge those.
Absolutely. We need ritual in our lives. We need ceremony. We need the opportunity just to, I remember in some of the courses that I used to do at Indigo around relationships, and we'd have a funeral for people's relationships, and there was a coffin there, and people would bring in physical things that reminded them of their past relationship, like old toys and gifts and cards, ticket stubs, letters, photos, all the things. And I kind of recommend that, if people are holding on to anything physical, that they do get rid of that as well, because it's, digital imprints of our relationships, all over the place. So if people want to do a good detox, I guess this is kind of like a bit of a ceremony of like truly letting go and just putting everything in the coffin and letting it burn.
Mm. Absolutely. And also for anyone who hasn't done our Get Your Shit Together course, our online course, there is an entire module that Mary leads that has to do with sort of letting go. And there's a guided meditation as well from Mary, which kind of takes you through that sort of experience where you're feeling it in your body and you're bringing the things up that, might be difficult, but are also important to come up before you can let them out. So it's one of our favorite things on the internet, the course. So feel free to jump onto our website and learn a little bit more. It's only $50 at the moment too, so good time to grab it. I think that brings us to the end of our half-hour sesh. Thanks so much, Mary, for all those beautiful tips.
Juicy topic. Always happy to have a chat.
Yeah, such good stuff to chat about. And I think even some of those tips and suggestions, I might try to pull together some resources to put them out on our socials so that people can have a little kind of step-by-step things that they can actually do practically.
Awesome. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for watching, everyone. It's always a pleasure having you, and you can catch this again on IGTV. We'll see you next week, Monday, 4 p.m.
Bye.
Bye.